The new season starts where the first season ended, and we are now at Pablo's prison, which is surrounded by soldiers from every direction searching for him. In the forest near the prison, we see a group of soldiers talking about Pablo, and one of them says that Pablo is a legendary person to the extent that he was killed before, burned, and came back to life again. Of course, this is a very fictional story, but it shows that the soldiers were very afraid of Pablo at that time. The biggest proof of that is that Pablo and his men passed in front of these soldiers, and one of them told Pablo that they were obliged to arrest him, but Pablo told him very calmly that he couldn't allow him to do that, took his men, and walked away without any of the soldiers doing anything to him. After his escape, Pablo went to the house where his mother, his wife Tata, and his children live, and began reassuring them. The next day, Pablo gathered with his men, or what was left of them, as he had lost many in the last attack on the prison. He told them that they must return to the city of Medellin, their hometown, and impose their control over the gangs there as before, so that everyone knows that Pablo has returned and is not hiding from the police. Pablo asked one of his men, named La Kika, to arrange for a car and a driver to be with him all the time so he could move around Medellin freely without anyone suspecting him. La Kika agreed and decided to proceed. But Pablo did not know that many gangs had already turned against him and would not come back under his control as before, the most important of these being the gang of Mrs. Judy Moncada. By the way, Judy is the wife of Kiko, the person whom Pablo killed in prison in the previous season when he thought he was betraying him. Now we see Judy sitting with her brother Jamie and her assistant Don Berna, telling them that they must find Pablo and kill him. She also informs them that all gangs must be told that anyone who sides with Pablo will also be killed. At this time, Don Berna thought for a moment and told Judy that he agreed with her and that they must expel Pablo. But the most important thing now is that they must stop working in their drug manufacturing labs until they can reach Pablo or the police reach him. If Pablo is at large, the police will be everywhere in the city, and they won't be able to do anything or manufacture drugs in their labs. Judy agreed with Don Berna, but Jamie was upset, as he believed they should continue manufacturing drugs as usual. Remember Jamie well for the future. We leave Judy and the others and move on to the Prisco brothers gang, known to be the most important gang in Medellin after Pablo's and Judy's gangs. The gang leader is the eldest brother, Ricardo, who was previously a doctor but chose the path of crime and began using his medical knowledge to torture his victims. Ricardo received a call from Pablo, who asked him if he was still on his side. Ricardo confirmed this. On the other hand, La Kika went to a taxi driver named Limon and asked him to be Pablo's personal driver. Limon agreed enthusiastically. For context, Limon is a taxi driver who works with brothels to transport prostitutes safely away from the eyes of the police. Limon was standing in front of one of the brothels when La Kika told him that he wanted him to bring a girl who would always be in the taxi while transporting Pablo from one place to another. Pablo would hide in the trunk of Limon's taxi, and the girl would be a decoy so that anyone who sees him would think he is transporting women, not Pablo. Limon decided to find a girl for this purpose, so he went to his neighbor and friend Maritza and offered her the job for a large amount of money. Maritza agreed because she needed the money. Limon, La Kika, and Maritza moved from the front of the brothel to go to Pablo, and a girl from the brothel saw them and was upset because she loves La Kika and thought he was cheating on her with Maritza. Remember this girl well for the future. They arrived at Pablo's location, and Maritza was blindfolded so she wouldn't know whom she was working with. Limon met Pablo, and they got acquainted. Pablo got into the trunk of Limon's taxi, and Limon began driving around. At each stop, Pablo would get out, enter a place, and meet one of his men who supplied him with money. The man told Pablo that money was scarce these days because of Judy's gang, which had prevented many gangs from working with them. Pablo became angry and told him he would deal with Judy soon, took some money, and left. While walking, people on the street recognized him, approached him, and greeted him. Pablo took out a lot of money and distributed it to the people to win their favor, as usual. In the midst of the crowd, Maritza saw Pablo and was surprised that he was the person she was helping to transport, but she didn't do anything. Elsewhere, Jamie was working in one of their drug labs and called Don Berna to tell him that he had opened the lab and was operating it. Not only that, but he also informed him that he had told Ricardo from the Prisco brothers gang about the location of the lab because Ricardo would bring his men to help protect it. Don Berna became angry and told Jamie that he was wrong to trust Ricardo. Before he could finish speaking, Jamie heard gunfire in the lab. Suddenly, Ricardo and his men, along with Pablo, entered and killed all of Jamie's men. Pablo himself killed Jamie, then spoke with Don Berna and told him he would get to him and Judy soon. Don Berna was furious and informed Judy about her brother's death, and they agreed to take revenge on Pablo no matter what. As for Pablo, he returned home after finishing his day's work. On the other side, When President Cesar Gaviria learned of Pablo's escape from prison, he went into a rage and held an emergency meeting with all his officials, ordering them to search for Pablo everywhere until they found him. Cesar appointed an army colonel named Pinzón to be responsible for capturing Pablo. We see Murphy at home, and his wife Connie is arguing with him, wanting him to return to the United States because it's not safe here. The biggest proof of that is that Pacho kidnapped him, as we saw in the previous season. Murphy tried to calm her down. After that, Javier Peña called Murphy and told him that Pablo had escaped. Murphy lost his composure, and he and Javier went to Pablo's prison to inspect it, but they found many officers and soldiers in front of the prison. A soldier told them that Colonel Pinzón, who was in charge of the case, refused to let them in until he and his men finished inspecting the prison. Murphy and Javier agreed and waited until Pinzón and his men finished their work. Afterward, they entered the prison and searched in hopes of finding anything that would help them reach Pablo, but they found nothing. They did not lose hope and went to Pinzón at his operations center and asked to join his mission to capture Pablo. Pinzón agreed and allowed them to stay at the center and work with his men. During this time, Murphy and Javier received a call from the girl at the brothel, informing them that La Kika, Pablo's assistant, would be there and they could capture him. Everyone was excited and began planning an important operation to arrest La Kika. But amidst all this, Connie called Murphy and told him something disastrous. She was at the airport and would be flying with their daughter to the United States to be safe. Connie hung up, forcing Murphy to leave Javier and the team and rush to the airport like a madman to catch his wife. When he arrived, he found out that the plane to the U.S. had already departed. He felt sad and frustrated. Murphy went into the bathroom and coincidentally saw two people using cocaine. From his experience, Murphy knew that these two were among those used by Pablo to transport drugs to the United States. Due to the situation with his wife and his extreme anger, he took out all his frustration on them, beating them until security arrived and pulled him away. Meanwhile, La Kika arrived at the brothel, and Limón was waiting outside. Shortly after, Javier arrived with a police force to arrest La Kika. The problem was that Limón saw them, so he quickly alerted La Kika, and both began to flee from Javier and his team. Javier and his team chased them, but unfortunately, they couldn't catch either of them. La Kika and Limón escaped, and Javier was extremely angry. That same night, Pablo met with the lawyer Duque, whom you might remember from the previous season, and told him he wanted to communicate with Cesar Gaviria, the president of Colombia, to try to convince him to return to his prison and reinstate the previous agreement. Duque agreed and went to talk to Cesar, but it was Eduardo Sandoval, Cesar's assistant, who responded. Duque informed Eduardo of Pablo's offer, but Eduardo didn't care and asked Duque to turn on the television to watch Cesar's new speech. Duque turned on the TV, and he and Pablo watched, surprised to see Cesar announce in his speech that the only solution to save and cleanse the country was by capturing the head of evil, Pablo Escobar. Consequently, Cesar announced a reward of $1,400,000 for anyone who helps them reach Pablo. At that moment, Pablo felt disheartened and realized that the coming days would not be easy at all. The next day, we see that La Kika goes to the brothel and keeps asking the girls there who informed on him, but of course, no one tells him anything. La Kika leaves the place as if he did nothing, while the girl who reported him is among them. At that time, we see Maritza standing among the people watching the house and the murdered girls. She realizes that La Kika must have done it and fears that he might suspect her too, so she decides to flee. On the other hand, despite President Cesar Gaviria's speech, Pablo Escobar did not surrender and hoped for negotiations with the president. Therefore, Pablo kidnaps a journalist and speaks with him in an interview, stating that he wants to make peace with Cesar and spend the remainder of his sentence in any other prison. Not only that, but he also wants to make peace with the United States and its new president, George Bush. Contrary to Pablo's expectations, Bush was strongly against drug trafficking. He appointed a new ambassador to Colombia, Arthur, who was a former commander in the U.S. Navy. Additionally, Bush appointed a person named Bill to be the head of intelligence in Colombia, and finally appointed Messina as the head of the Drug Enforcement Administration, DEA, office in Colombia, effectively making her the boss of Steve Murphy and Javier Peña. Ambassador Arthur held a meeting with the embassy staff, but Murphy was not present. Arthur informed everyone that their primary goal is to eliminate Pablo and that they will be provided with all necessary resources to achieve this. He spoke with a staff member named Edward, responsible for communication surveillance, and asked him to expand his monitoring to locate Pablo. After the meeting, Javier spoke with his boss, Messina, who informed him that she intends to punish Murphy for his incident at the airport and his absence from work. Javier asked her to forgive him because he's a good and diligent officer but made a mistake due to his wife leaving him and returning to America. Messina understood and decided not to punish Murphy. Javier met with Murphy and told him about Messina's decision. Murphy was happy and went with Javier to Colonel Pinzone's operations center, where they would be working from now on. Messina sat with Murphy, admonished him for his past behavior, and warned him against causing more problems. He promised to comply. Murphy and Javier were assigned to the center to monitor any information related to Pablo. Due to the reward offered by Caesar, they received a lot of information, but most of it was misleading, orchestrated by Pablo's men. On one occasion, they went on a mission to capture Pablo at a specific house, but found no one, only a picture-mocking bush, realizing they had been tricked. Meanwhile, Limon and La Kika go to meet Pablo. Pablo speaks with Limon, telling him that any informant must be killed and that defending or hiding one is unacceptable. Then, La Kika explains to Limon that Pablo means Maritza and that she must be killed because she might have informed on them. Limon is upset because Maritza is his longtime friend, but he cannot refuse La Kika's request. First, Limon and La Kika go to pick up a bathtub that Pablo requested, remember this for later. Then they head to Maritza's house to eliminate her. They search the house, and Limon finds her but doesn't inform La Kika, telling him she isn't there and they can kill her another time. La Kika is frustrated but leaves. Maritza escapes from the house and goes to a place we'll learn about later. Back to Pablo, he receives a call from Duque, who tells him that President Caesar has agreed to meet and negotiate with him. Duque goes to the presidential palace but is surprised to be met by Attorney General Gustavo. Gustavo tells Duque that he doesn't agree with the president on killing Pablo but believes it's better to prosecute him and make an agreement. Gustavo expresses his willingness to negotiate with Pablo, making Duque happy, who then informs Pablo of the good news. Pablo isn't entirely convinced that an agreement with Gustavo will lead to a solution but decides to give it a try. Meanwhile, Javier and Murphy receive news that one of Pablo's men, La Kika, was seen purchasing a bathtub similar to the one in Pablo's prison, implying that Pablo likes this bathtub and will install it in his hideout. Excited, Javier and Murphy ask Edward, the surveillance officer, to tap into calls in the area where La Kika was spotted. Edward agrees and begins his work. Edward informs them that he intercepted a call from one of Pablo's men named Velasco and pinpointed his house location. Javier and Murphy are thrilled and ask Messina to talk to Pinzone about deploying a force to capture Pablo. Messina speaks with Pinzone, but he refuses, thinking they're wasting time. Messina contacts Ambassador Arthur, who, in turn, contacts the presidential office, forcing Pinzone to send a force with Murphy, Javier, and Messina to capture Pablo. Despite this, Pinzone is annoyed and decides to sabotage the mission. Pinzone goes out with a very large force without attempting to be discreet. Velasco notices them and alerts Pablo, who gathers his family and escapes through secret tunnels under his houses. Pinzone, his men, Javier, Murphy, and Messina enter but find no one, leaving them frustrated. The next day, Tata talks to Pablo, telling him that the police won't stop until they kill him, so he must flee the country. But escape isn't in Pablo's vocabulary, he decides to spread chaos. He sends his men throughout Medellin, declaring war on the police. Pablo's men start killing police officers by shooting and bombing, turning the city into a massive slaughterhouse for law enforcement. After these events, Pinzone can't handle it and decides to retire. Caesar attends a memorial for the fallen officers and tells his assistant, Eduardo, that he won't surrender to Pablo or negotiate with him but will continue pursuing him. Therefore, Caesar decides to bring back Colonel Horacio Carrillo to Colombia to chase Pablo. Carrillo receives the call while working at the Colombian embassy in Spain and promptly returns. Meanwhile, Pablo goes to Judy Moncada's house and takes it over with his men, but Judy and Don Berna have already escaped. Pablo captures a group of Judy's men, telling them they will either willingly or unwillingly reveal the locations of all her drug labs, or they will be killed. Frightened, they decide to confess. Speaking of Judy, she reaches Pacho Herrera's base and requests to meet his boss or business partner. Pacho agrees, and shortly after, Gilberto Rodriguez arrives in his private plane. Before explaining what Judy does with him, let's introduce Gilberto. Gilberto Rodriguez is a veteran gangster who started in the field years ago with his brother Miguel Rodriguez. Initially bank robbers, they used the money to start trading marijuana. After some time, they met Pablo and decided to ally with him in cocaine trafficking, and their business flourished. A young enthusiastic man named Pacho worked with Gilberto and Miguel, proving his worth, and they made him a partner to manage the operations. Gilberto and Miguel presented themselves as investors, economists, and businessmen, becoming societal stars. No one knew that all this was a front for their cocaine trafficking. Returning to the present, Judy meets with Gilberto, Miguel, and Pacho, telling them she wants to ally with them to eliminate Pablo. Gilberto thinks and tells Judy he has a better solution. She should inform the police about her drug lab's locations, which Pablo and his men will attempt to seize. This way, the police will take care of Pablo and his men without them having to do anything. Judy considers his words and decides to implement the plan. Meanwhile, Carrillo meets with Murphy and Javier, telling them that Medellin is full of informants working for Pablo, children who report police movements, allowing Pablo to escape. Therefore, they must capture these children one by one to prevent them from informing Pablo. When asked how to do this, he explains that it's simple. Carrillo gathers a large police force and roams the city. As he does, the child informants watch and alert each other. Carrillo continues until he reaches a square with pictures of Pablo, where he urinates on them. The news reaches Pablo, who becomes furious. Back at the center, Carrillo and Murphy speak with Edward, who tells them he intercepted signals and calls from the child informants and located them. Carrillo is overjoyed, takes Javier and a police force, and arrests all the children, the oldest being no more than 15 years old. Without hesitation, Carrillo kills one of the children and tells the others that anyone working with Pablo will meet the same fate. He gives a bullet to a child named David, instructing him to deliver it to Pablo and tell him it's the bullet that will kill him. After this, Javier and Carrillo return to the center. Javier tells Murphy what happened, and Murphy is upset because killing children is unacceptable, no matter what. The next day, David meets with Pablo and tells him everything. Pablo isn't concerned but decides to use David to tarnish Carrillo's reputation. He takes David to meet journalist Valeria, where David shares his story on camera. Pablo is pleased, believing this will expose Carrillo. Meanwhile, Don Berna contacts Javier, requesting a meeting. Javier meets him, and Berna provides the location of Judy's lab so the police can capture Pablo or at least his men. Carrillo, Javier, and Murphy raid the lab Berna mentioned, capturing many of Pablo's men, including 2 key associates. Carrillo takes the 2 men on a flight, interrogating them about Pablo's location, but they remain silent. In a fit of rage, Carrillo throws one out of the plane, then asks the second for Pablo's whereabouts. Despite his extreme fear, he refuses to betray Pablo, so Carrillo throws him out as well, without remorse. Murphy is terrified, thinking this is madness, but says nothing. The following day, David's video airs nationwide. Among the viewers are President Caesar and his assistant Eduardo. Caesar tells Eduardo that Carrillo must be held accountable if he indeed killed the child, but Eduardo convinces him to ignore it until Carrillo finishes off Pablo, after which they can deal with him. Caesar agrees. Pablo is angry and tells Duque he will write letters to all newspapers to expose Carrillo. He begins writing, hoping they'll be published, but all newspapers refuse. Frustrated, he realizes there's no hope in getting rid of Carrillo. Besides his issue with Carrillo, Pablo faces other problems, notably the Castaño brothers, led by siblings Fidel and Carlos. This is a far-right group they founded after their father was killed by communists, seeking revenge against any communist. They're heavily armed due to U.S. support. The new leadership at the U.S. embassy contacts them, asking them to eliminate Pablo, claiming he's a communist because of his previous collaboration with the M19 communist group, as seen in the previous season.
They're told that if they help eliminate Pablo, U.S. support will increase.
Seeing this as an unmissable opportunity, the brothers meet with Judy, Gilberto, and Miguel, proposing collaboration to eliminate Pablo. They're told a decision will be made later. However, Gilberto and Miguel don't need to do much, as Pablo is already falling apart, losing his men's trust, especially Limon. Limon meets with Maritza at her farm, telling her he's tired of working with Pablo and feels he could be killed at any moment. He asks her to help trap Pablo by informing the Americans of his location, promising substantial money in return. Maritza is hesitant but agrees to help. Shortly after, Gabby, a friend of Javier, contacts him, requesting a meeting. Javier meets Maritza there, who is Gabby's friend. Maritza agrees to help Javier trap Pablo, providing valuable information. Javier is delighted. The next day, Limon calls Maritza, informing her of a specific location where he and Pablo will be shortly. Limon then takes Pablo to that location. Meanwhile, Maritza informs Javier, who is thrilled and plans to go with Murphy, Carrillo, and a police force to capture Pablo. However, Messina, their boss, refuses to let them go because Ambassador Arthur instructed her to prevent them from accompanying Carrillo, fearing Carrillo's reckless actions could tarnish America's reputation. Javier and Murphy are frustrated but comply. Carrillo goes out with a force toward Pablo but fails to reach him because suddenly, a police car explodes due to a planted bomb. Trucks block the road, and Pablo's men appear, firing at Carrillo and his team. It was an ambush orchestrated by Pablo and Limon. Pablo's men eliminate everyone and wound Carrillo. Pablo himself arrives, telling Carrillo that he gave the bullet to David to deliver, and now he's using it on him. Pablo shoots Carrillo multiple times, avenging his cousin Gustavo, whom Carrillo killed in the previous season, then leaves. Unfortunately, Carrillo dies. Despite his madness and reckless actions, his primary goal was to capture Pablo, but he failed in his own way. Javier is deeply saddened, feeling responsible for Carrillo's death. Upon learning of Carrillo's death, Gilberto, Judy, and the others decide to collaborate with Fidel and Carlos to eliminate Pablo. We'll see how they cooperate later. Finally, we see Caesar with Eduardo, who tells him that Attorney General Gustavo hates him and will urge Caesar to negotiate with Pablo tonight. Realizing this can't happen, Eduardo asks Caesar to sacrifice Gustavo so he can continue his presidency until Pablo is eliminated. Caesar is reassured by Eduardo's loyalty and thanks him. Later, Maritza sits in a church, and suddenly, Limon, La Kika, and Pablo enter. She's terrified, thinking they'll kill her, but instead, they give her money to start a new life. Limon tells her he lied but secured her and her daughter's future with this money, then leaves. Meanwhile, Murphy returns home, saddened by Carrillo's death, but is somewhat uplifted when he finds his wife, Connie, has returned from America to see him. We leave them and go to Javier, who sits in a bar. Don Berna approaches him, requesting his company on an important matter. Javier goes with him to a house where Judy, Fidel, and Carlos are present. They propose collaborating with Javier to trap Pablo. Initially, Javier refuses to listen, not wanting to work with drug traffickers like Judy or extremists like Carlos and Fidel, but he eventually hears them out. They promise to help him in every way to reach and eliminate Pablo, their common enemy. To convince him, Judy gives Javier Maritza's address, telling him she's the girl who deceived him. Javier takes the address, unsure of his next move. In the following period, Pablo's life stabilizes significantly after Carrillo's death, and his business thrives more than before. Because of this, Caesar visits the police academy, attending a new class's graduation. He meets an officer named Martinez, asking him to take over the mission to find Pablo in place of Carrillo. Martinez refuses, so Caesar tells him that his son, who just graduated, has joined the mission. How could he abandon him? Realizing Caesar is manipulating him using his son, Martinez accepts the assignment. We leave them and return to Pablo, who is now settled in Carlos's house, the brother of Tata, Pablo's wife. Carlos lives in Miami, managing Pablo's operations there. Pablo tells Carlos that things are stabilizing and that he will increase operations. Therefore, Carlos will come to Colombia, and soon they'll bring Leon from America so they can meet and plan expansion. If you don't recall, Leon was the first person Pablo worked with in smuggling drugs to Miami and is currently settled there, providing money for Pablo. At the same time, Javier goes to arrest Maritza, but she tells him she was deceived just like him. Javier believes her and decides to utilize her. Shortly after, Limon meets Maritza at a restaurant. It's not important what they discussed, what's important is that Javier and a Colombian officer were surveilling the place, having arranged with Maritza to bring Limon there. After a while, Limon leaves, and Javier and the officer follow him to a house he enters. Javier sees Velasco there, who gives Limon a bag containing drugs to deliver elsewhere. Limon and Velasco leave together. Velasco speaks to Limon, then departs. Javier sees Velasco and is thrilled because he's one of Pablo's key men, suspecting there might be others at that location. He decides to bring in backup to arrest them and contacts the operations center, but they refuse since Martinez hasn't officially taken command, and no one can authorize such a force now. Frustrated, Javier decides to act on his own. He contacts Don Berna, Fidel, and Carlos, requesting their help. Shortly after, they arrive armed and enter the house with Javier and the officer. Without warning, they start shooting anyone they see. Velasco tries to escape but is caught, and they decide to take him for interrogation. Don Berna begins torturing him, but Velasco says nothing. Berna takes a document from Velasco and gives it to Judy, containing information about 3 of Pablo's accountants and about Leon, who will arrive in Colombia to meet Pablo. Judy sends the information to Gilberto to handle. The next day, we see Leon arriving in Colombia, greeted by Navegante, Pacho's assistant. Navegante takes him to Gilberto, Pacho, and Miguel. We don't know exactly what they do with Leon, but shortly after, Blackie, one of Pablo's men, informs him that Velasco has disappeared and that Leon called saying he arrived in Colombia but didn't find Velasco waiting, so he got scared and returned to Miami. Pablo is furious and orders his men to search for Velasco everywhere and bring him to him. On the other side, and at the same time, we see Steve Murphy having dinner with his wife Connie at a restaurant. We learn that Connie will soon return to America because she no longer feels safe in the country. She was only visiting Murphy. Currently, Murphy is feeling down and goes to attend the first meeting held by Colonel Martinez at the Operations Center. Martinez gathers all his men and informs them of the way they will work from now on. First, their method will be legal, and they won't commit any violations as Carrillo used to. The most important thing is that Martinez shares his new strategy to capture Pablo Escobar. When Javier Peña hears this strategy, he becomes frustrated, realizing it won't be enough to bring Pablo down, so he decides to act on his own. Peña goes to meet Don Berna and tells him that he will provide a lot of information about Escobar's hitman and other armed individuals, but he won't give any information on the locations of Escobar's labs, because he doesn't want Berna and his group to expand in the drug market. He also doesn't want to have to face them later. Berna understands Peña's reasoning, and they strike a deal. From that moment on, Peña starts passing information to Berna, who then relays it to Fidel and Carlos Castaño. The Castaño brothers descend into the city and start killing anyone associated with Escobar's men without any hesitation. They create a huge massacre among Pablo's men. Later, we see Blackie go to Escobar and tell him that there are armed men in the city killing their people, and no one knows who these men are. Around the same time, La Kika calls Pablo and informs him that the place where Velasco was located seems to have been the site of a major battle, and Velasco has disappeared. This drives Pablo crazy, and he realizes that a new war has begun, and this time, it's not with the police. On the other side, we see Gilberto Rodriguez having a meeting with Miguel Rodriguez and Pacho Herrera. They discuss how Carlos and Fidel are doing a good job, but they're also very violent. If anyone, including Pablo or anyone else, finds out that they are working with them, everyone will turn against them. Therefore, it's essential that no one knows that Carlos and Fidel are associated with them. Everyone agrees with Gilberto's plan. The next day, we see Peña and Murphy go to a location in the street, where they find Velasco's body hanging, with a large note around his neck that says, "Pablo, you and your loved ones have no safe place. Regards, Los Pepes." Los Pepes, of course, is the alias used by the group led by the Castaño brothers, Carlos and Fidel. The name Los Pepes stands for people persecuted by Pablo Escobar. That same day, Pablo is in one of his car warehouses, which has been completely burned down, obviously by Los Pepes. Pablo sits with all his men and wonders who could have done this, until he becomes convinced that it was likely Gilberto Rodriguez and his cartel. He decides to seek revenge, but only after he is 100% sure that they were responsible. Ricardo Prisco, by the way, is currently with the group and tells Pablo that Los Pepes had attacked them before and injured one of their men. The injured person is in the hospital, and since Ricardo is a doctor by training, he tells Pablo that he will find a way to reach the injured man and find out who he's working for. Pablo agrees, and they make plans to get answers. After some time, the actions of Los Pepes spread across the city, with numerous killings committed by the group. We then see Cesar Gaviria meeting with his leadership team, and they inform him that Los Pepes must be condemned for their actions, but Gaviria decides to delay dealing with them, hoping they might rid him of Pablo first. On the other hand, we see Murphy and Peña meeting with Martinez and his men, and Martinez informs them that they have managed to pinpoint a specific location where one of Escobar's men, Jairo, might be frequently visiting. Martinez decides to monitor the location until they can confirm Jairo's presence. Peña takes this information and immediately goes to meet Berna, sharing with him the location where Jairo might be, which is his mother's house, as she is ill. We see Jairo at his mother's house, and then Carlos and Fidel arrive with their men to take Jairo and kill him. By the time Peña, Martinez, and Murphy arrive at the location, Jairo is already gone. At this point, Murphy begins to suspect that something is wrong and that someone from within their organization is collaborating with Los Pepes. However, he doesn't yet know who it is. Later, the group identifies the location of another one of Pablo's men, Blackie, who regularly visits his fiancée's house. Peña informs Murphy of this, and Murphy goes to Martinez to request that they move in quickly to arrest Blackie at his fiancée's house without wasting time on surveillance. Martinez agrees and takes a team, including Peña and Murphy, to apprehend Blackie. Peña, realizing that trouble is about to happen, quickly calls Berna and orders him to tell Carlos and Fidel to stay away from the area. Immediately, Berna contacts them and tells them to leave the location quickly. At that moment, Carlos, Fidel, and their men were on their way to Blackie's fiancée's house. They try to flee, but unfortunately, they run into a police checkpoint, where Martinez's son is stationed. When he becomes suspicious of them, he orders them out of the vehicle at gunpoint. Carlos and Fidel's men also pull their guns, and Carlos manages to grab Martinez's son's weapon. The situation is about to escalate further, but Peña and Murphy arrive in time to calm things down. Peña instructs Carlos to return the weapon to Martinez's son, allowing him and his men to leave. As for Martinez, he arrives late and reprimands his son for losing his weapon, but that's not the important part. What really matters is that Murphy, after all that had happened, tells Peña that he now knows that Carlos and Fidel are behind Los Pepes and that Peña is helping them. Peña finally admits to Murphy that he is correct, and that he's doing this just to take down Pablo, nothing more. Murphy isn't fully convinced, but he doesn't say anything and lets it slide. Meanwhile, throughout all of this, Blackie manages to escape. On the other side, we see Ricardo Prisco reaching the injured man from Carlos and Fidel's gang. He tortures him to force him to reveal who he works for. Afterward, Ricardo goes to Pablo and his men, informing Pablo that Los Pepes are really Carlos and Fidel, and they are trying to kill him with the help of Gilberto Rodriguez and his cartel. At this point, Pablo goes berserk and vows to take harsh revenge on Gilberto and his allies. That same night, during the wedding of Gilberto's daughter, a bomb goes off, planted by Pablo's men. However, the bomb doesn't kill Gilberto, Pacho, or Miguel. Following this incident, they regroup and vow to retaliate by wiping out Pablo, his family, and all his men, no matter how many there are. After a few days, we see Pablo's mother deciding to leave the house to go to church to pray, even though Pablo had given strict orders that no one is to leave the house. Pablo's mother goes to church, finishes her prayers, and returns home safely. When she arrives, she finds Pablo and everyone waiting for her. They scold her for what she did because someone could have followed her and found their hideout. Just as they are arguing, Carlos and Fidel's men launch an attack, firing at the house. Pablo and his men return fire like madmen and try to escape. Many of Pablo's men die in the shootout, including Tata's brother Carlos, and she goes mad with grief. Quickly, Pablo and the remaining men escape before they too are killed and go to a safe house. In that house, Pablo tells Tata that she must take their children and leave the country to live safely elsewhere. As for him, he will stay to settle scores with the police, the Americans, Gilberto's cartel, and the Castaño brothers. He vows to take revenge on anyone who wronged him or his men. After all this, we see Pablo starting to blow up stores and properties owned by Miguel and Gilberto, seeking revenge. As for Pablo himself, we see him with his family in the house, and we learn that they are all planning to leave the country to be safe. At the same time, Ambassador Arthur and Messina are sitting with Cesar Gaviria, informing him that Pablo has booked tickets for his family and that they will be leaving. They cannot allow them to leave Colombia because they are an important pressure point against Pablo. Gaviria thinks about this and tells everyone that he will contact the foreign minister to see what can be done. Messina believes that if they wait for the foreign minister's response, Pablo's family will have already left the country. So, she contacts Murphy and asks him to go to the airport and delay Pablo's family as much as possible until the foreign minister orders that they remain in the country. Murphy agrees and heads to the airport, closely tracking Pablo's family and learning that they are traveling to Germany. He decides to travel with them on the same plane. After a short while, they arrive at the German airport. Murphy immediately goes to one of the officers and asks him to stop Pablo's family until he receives an order to send them back to Colombia. The officer agrees and goes to Pablo's family, holding them in a separate area at the airport. Murphy stays with them the entire time to keep an eye on them. On the other side, this information reaches Pablo, and he learns that his family has been detained at the airport in Germany. Furious, the first thing he does is call the German embassy in Colombia and tells them that if his family is not allowed into Germany immediately, he will kill any German citizen on Colombian soil. After ending his call with the embassy, Pablo contacts the airport in Germany and informs them that he will blow up any plane coming from Colombia to Germany if they don't immediately allow his family to enter the country. Unfortunately for Pablo, none of his attempts work. As a last resort, he contacts prosecutor Gustavo and asks him to protect his family and allow them into Germany. However, Gustavo doesn't even respond to Pablo's request and instead goes to see Gaviria, asking him to send Pablo's family back to Colombia but to ensure their protection so that they don't end up like the extremist groups that want to kill them. After all, they are only guilty of being Pablo's family. Gaviria considers this and sees it as the safest option. In Germany, officers come to Pablo's family and inform them that they will be sent back to Colombia. Meanwhile, Murphy observes everything and returns with them on the same flight to Colombia. During the flight, Tata notices Murphy's presence and realizes that he traveled with them to Germany and returned with them. She feels uneasy the whole time but doesn't say anything specific. After a short while, the plane lands in Colombia. At the airport, a force from the Colombian police arrives to take Pablo's family and ensure their safety. Away from Pablo, we see that Duque was driving his car casually when suddenly gunmen from Carlos and Fidel's group ambush him, opening fire. Duque takes cover, and the gunmen continue shooting at him, but he manages to escape. Upon his escape, Duque goes to his ex-wife's house and begs her to leave with him and their son to avoid getting killed, but his ex-wife refuses and leaves him. At that moment, Duque sees the key to his ex-wife's car, so he takes it without her knowing and drives off in her car because his car was destroyed in the shootout. He then picks up his son from school, and they head to a hotel to hide while he figures out what to do next. On the other side, Peña meets with Berna and tells him he no longer wants to work with him because Carlos and Fidel have gone mad, killing civilians and not caring about anyone. Berna assures Peña that it won't happen again and asks him for Duque's location so they can finish him off since he escaped. Peña agrees and goes to work, meeting with surveillance officer Eduardo. He asks Eduardo to locate Duque, and Eduardo does his job, returning to Peña with the location of Duque, who is hiding in a hotel with his son. At this moment, Peña reflects and realizes that Duque's son is just a child, so he decides not to hand him over to Carlos and Fidel, as they would kill him too. Instead, he offers Duque a deal. Peña meets with Duque and tells him he will protect him and his son and send them to America, but in exchange, Duque must cooperate and help take down Pablo. Duque, desperate to save his son, agrees and tells Peña he will return to him later. Afterward, we see Berna, Carlos, Fidel, and Judy Moncada meeting together. Carlos informs everyone that he knows Peña is working with them and is aware of Duque's location, but he's lying to them. Carlos now decides that he will deal with Peña, but Berna opposes him. Carlos then decides to take a different approach and asks Berna to arrange a meeting with Peña at a certain location because he wants to see him face to face. Berna does so, and that night, Peña goes to meet Berna but is surprised to find CIA officer Bill Steckner instead. Without any preamble, Bill tells Peña that he's been working with Carlos and Fidel, and it was Bill who asked them to collaborate with Peña. Bill also informs Peña that Carlos and Fidel had discovered Duque's location without his help, but if Peña doesn't assist them when they need him, they will kill him. Peña is shocked by all this and leaves the meeting, clearly shaken. Peña then goes to the hotel where Duque and his son are hiding, only to find them both dead in the trunk of a car, brutally murdered. Peña becomes furious and goes to the operations center, where he confronts Colombian officer Trejo. Trejo is the same officer who worked with Peña when they first brought Berna in to help them on a mission. Peña accuses Trejo of being the one who leaked Duque's location to Berna. Trejo confirms this, stating that he did the right thing to help bring down Pablo and anyone who supports him. Peña is enraged but leaves the situation for now. Meanwhile, on the other side, Pablo learns that his wife and family are being held by the police in Colombia. He goes into a frenzy, contacting Blackie and ordering him to plant a massive bomb near the presidential palace to send a message to President Gaviria that if he continues supporting Carlos and Fidel against him and pressures his family, his fate will be death. Blackie agrees, and his men plant a bomb near the presidential palace. The next day, in a nearby shopping mall, the bomb explodes, killing dozens of people, most of them children, as it was back to school season, and parents and children were shopping for school supplies. This horrific act turns the entire country against Pablo, as he has now crossed all lines. Even the people of his hometown, who had always supported him no matter what, have now turned against him, realizing that Pablo must be stopped. Among those watching the news and realizing that Pablo's reign is over are Gilberto, Pacho, and Miguel. They decide to make a new move in their battle against Pablo. They send Pacho to Miami to meet with León. We learn that Gilberto had convinced León to work with him instead of Pablo, and León agreed. Pacho arrives in Miami with his loyal aide Navegante. León introduces them to Pablo's accountants and smugglers, who will now work for them. This means that the entire Miami operation is now under Pacho's control, along with the rest of the cartel. As for León, on one occasion, Pacho brought him to the hotel where he was staying, and without any preamble, Navegante attacked and killed him. This was done to maintain control over the operations in Miami and to prevent Pablo from thinking about returning to that business again. Moving away from Pacho, we now turn to Pablo, where we see him communicating with Attorney General Gustavo. Gustavo tells Pablo that what he has done recently is madness and that he must surrender to avoid further consequences. Pablo agrees on the condition that his family leaves Colombia and is safe. Tata informs him that Gustavo will try to find a solution and will let him know soon. But I'd like to tell you, my friend, that Gustavo didn't reach any result. He goes to meet President Cesar Gaviria and asks him to allow Pablo's family to leave to a safe place in exchange for Pablo surrendering himself. But Cesar completely refuses and tells Gustavo that he doesn't intend to arrest Pablo but plans to eliminate him entirely. As for Pablo, he wasn't comfortable with this situation, so he sent Blackie to the hotel where Tata and his family were being held, to keep a close watch and ensure that his family was always safe. But the problem is that Blackie gets arrested. When he's captured, Javier Peña and Steve Murphy take over the interrogation. They tell him he could be sentenced to death or help them capture Pablo in exchange for a reduced sentence or acquittal. But Blackie completely refuses to betray Pablo. Murphy and Javier decide to get any information they can from him about La Kika. On the other side, we see Judy Moncada and Don Berna going to meet a gang called the Galeano Gang, one of the most important gangs in the city of Medellin. Judy agrees with them to join her and the Los Pepes group instead of Pablo. The gang agrees, and they decide to hold a meeting with Judy, Berna, and the Los Pepes gang at a specific place after a few days to arrange their operations. However, one of the members of the Galeano gang named Hector goes to meet La Kika and tells him everything that happened. In turn, La Kika goes to Pablo and informs him of all the details, letting him know that the Galeano gang agreed with Judy to betray him, even though they were on his side. La Kika also tells them about the scheduled meeting place after a few days to arrange business matters. Pablo thinks for a moment and then orders La Kika and Limon to closely monitor the place and learn everything about it because on the day of the meeting between the Galeano gang, Judy, and Los Pepes, Pablo plans to attack the location with his remaining men and eliminate everyone. He instructs the accountant to provide as much money as possible to hire men and buy weapons to assist them. Everyone agrees with him and decides to execute the plan. We see that La Kika and Limon indeed go to surveil the place where Judy and her associates will meet with the Galeano gang. Now, my friend, let's shift from all these events and focus on Tata. Tata desperately wants to talk to Pablo in any way possible because she and his family are being held in a hotel under constant surveillance by officers, and they know nothing about Pablo. She contacts the journalist Valeria and asks for her help to communicate with him. Valeria goes to meet Pablo, who gives her a bag containing a wireless communication device and money to give to Tata when she meets her at the hotel, under the pretense of conducting an interview. Pablo offers Valeria a lot of money to carry out this mission, but she refuses and tells him that since she met him, she has truly loved him and has never helped him for money. Pablo thanks her for that. Valeria then goes to the hotel where Tata is staying and meets her under the guise of conducting an interview, but in reality, she gives her the wireless communication device. Tata begins to communicate with Pablo naturally without anyone knowing. Everything is going well until the next day when Tata finds the police everywhere in front of the hotel. She goes down to see what's happening and discovers that Valeria has been killed in her car, left in front of the hotel. Of course, those who did this are Los Pepes. Tata completely breaks down and contacts Pablo to tell him what happened. The death of Valeria drives Pablo literally crazy, so he gathers his men La Kika, Limon, Ricardo, and the accountant, and tells them they must now go and collect all the money from their hideouts and go to Ricardo's men so that Ricardo can gather them and bring all this money to attack the Los Pepes group and Judy and her gang. Everyone agrees with him. La Kika, the accountant, and Ricardo go to get the money, leaving only Limon with Pablo. At this time, Javier Peña, Steve Murphy, and all the police officers in Medellin are trying to reach La Kika by tracking his phone, which they obtained from Blackie after he decided to turn over La Kika, as I mentioned to you. Currently, Javier and Murphy are trying to call La Kika to determine his location, and indeed, La Kika answers his phone. They manage to pinpoint his location in the city and move toward him. At that moment, La Kika was with Ricardo and the accountant in a hideout collecting money, but suddenly La Kika kills Ricardo and the accountant, takes the money, and we find out that he decided to escape, abandoning Pablo and betraying everyone. But that doesn't happen. Murphy, Javier, and the police catch up and manage to arrest him. After these events, Javier and Murphy interrogate La Kika, who decides to turn in Pablo to get a reduced sentence. He tells them that Pablo and Limon are currently heading to a specific place where Ricardo's men are gathering, to take them and then attack Judy and the Los Pepes gang. To confirm his information, La Kika calls Pablo and Limon to verify if they are going to Ricardo's men. At that moment, Pablo and Limon are indeed in the car on their way to Ricardo's men, but Pablo senses that La Kika's way of speaking has changed. With his years of experience, he immediately realizes that La Kika has been captured and is trying to betray him. He decides to flee immediately and has Limon change direction. As for Ricardo's men, they were indeed in a hideout, and we see Javier, Murphy, and the rest of the police surveilling them. When they notice that Pablo is late and hasn't arrived, they realize he isn't coming at all. They immediately attack these men, eliminating many and arresting others. Pablo continues on his way with Limon, not knowing what awaits them next or how they'll handle all these troubles. After a short while, Pablo and Limon arrive at a farm, where Pablo meets an old man. Pablo sits with this man and talks to him, and from their conversation, we learn that this old man is Pablo's father. We also find out that he had separated from Pablo's mother a long time ago and has been living peacefully on his farm, uninvolved in crime or anything else. Pablo asks to hide there for a few days, and despite not approving of his son's path at all, his father agrees because he's his son. Now, my friend, since Pablo arrived at his father's place, he has disappeared completely, and no one knows anything about him. Consequently, everything changes in Medellin. For instance, the Los Pepes group no longer plays any role in the city, but they were controlling several drug labs belonging to Pablo and Judy, which contained a lot of drugs. Based on this, the brothers Carlos and Fidel, leaders of Los Pepes, contacted Gilberto Rodriguez and informed him that their work was done and that they now have many cocaine labs. They asked Gilberto what they should do. Without hesitation, Gilberto tells them that this cocaine is now theirs, and they can sell it and use the money to support their group to resume fighting the communists. We learn that Gilberto is doing this not to support Carlos and Fidel but to ignite a war between them and Judy to eliminate her as well, leaving Medellin entirely for Gilberto. What Gilberto wants happens exactly. Carlos and Fidel discuss that the drug trade will be very profitable for them, and since they have many labs, they can produce and sell, but they must eliminate Judy entirely so she doesn't compete with them in their business. Speaking of Judy, one day she was about to take her car and go on a trip, but suddenly the car explodes. Judy isn't harmed, but she realizes that Carlos and Fidel tried to eliminate her. She tells Don Berna that she will turn in Carlos, Fidel, and Gilberto's gang to Javier Peña because she's certain they ordered Carlos and Fidel to kill her. Berna didn't like Judy's talk very much and saw that she had become an informant. However, he still does what she asks, bringing in Javier Peña. Javier makes an agreement with Judy Moncada that he will protect her and grant her immunity, but she must hand over the Gilberto Rodriguez Orihuela cartel and Los Pepes gang. Javier agrees and leaves. After that, Javier goes to meet with his boss, Messina, and tells her everything that happened. Messina agrees to set up a meeting with Judy to get all the information that will help them take down Gilberto Rodriguez Orihuela, Carlos Letter, and Fidel Castaño. After that, they will grant her immunity. Javier informs Messina that he will work on this important matter and then leaves. Up to this point, everything was going well, but everything changed when Berna went to meet with Gilberto Rodriguez Orihuela, Pacho Herrera, and Miguel Rodriguez Orihuela. He informs them that he wants to work with them instead of Judy Moncada because Judy has become an informant, and he doesn't work with informants or snitches. Gilberto and the others are pleased and make an agreement with Berna. Then, Berna takes Judy under the pretense that they are going to meet Javier at a location so she can confess and receive immunity. But Berna doesn't go to Javier. Instead, he goes to a place with armed men, including Fidel Castaño and Carlos Letter, and a CIA plane. Berna then tells Judy that he has agreed with Gilberto to manage the business in Medellin on his behalf, and Carlos and Fidel will work with him. The profits will be divided among them. As for Judy, she won't be killed and can be an informant as she wants, but not for Javier and the DEA, rather for Bill Steckner and the CIA. Of course, Bill and the CIA have an agreement with Carlos and Fidel and don't want to lose it. Judy is shocked by all this but is forced to agree reluctantly to Berna's terms. She boards the plane and leaves with the American intelligence agents. Meanwhile, we see that Javier was waiting for Judy at a location, but she doesn't show up. Javier goes to the embassy and finds Bill waiting for him. Bill informs Javier that he was wrong to think about making a deal with Judy behind his back, so he took Judy from him and will make her work with him. Bill tells him that Judy will now appear on a program and will talk about a lot of information she knows about the drug world, including information about a DEA agent collaborating with her and Los Pepes, obviously referring to Javier. He also informs him that because of all this, Messina has been transferred to another location, and he must go to the ambassador now because the ambassador intends to send him back to America. When Javier hears all this, he becomes furious and asks Bill, "Who are you protecting? Are you protecting Carlos and Fidel to fight the communists, or are you also protecting Gilberto and his cartel?" Bill tells Javier that he is not protecting Gilberto and his cartel, but he doesn't want them to fall right now because he needs them very much. Bill then leaves Javier calmly and walks away. Javier is very confused and doesn't know what to do or what will happen to him next. Elsewhere, we see Tata, Pablo Escobar's wife, always trying to communicate with him but can't reach him at all because, by the way, Pablo's father's farm has no network coverage. On one occasion, a police officer protecting Tata and Pablo's family sees Tata trying to communicate with Pablo and also learns the frequency she uses to contact him. He takes this information and goes to meet Steve Murphy and informs him. Murphy is thrilled and gathers Colonel Hugo Martinez and the other officers. They agree to monitor these frequencies very closely until Pablo manages to communicate with Tata, and then they will determine his location and eliminate him. Speaking of Pablo, we see that he is living a very quiet life with his father and Limon on the farm. But what always worried Pablo was that he couldn't communicate with his wife at all. One time, Pablo is with his father, and his father tells him that he is ashamed of him for being a killer and a criminal. This upsets Pablo greatly, so he decides to leave the farm entirely. Pablo calls Limon and informs him that there is a certain tree on the farm under which a lot of money is buried. He asks Limon to bring this money urgently so they can leave. Limon agrees and goes to the tree, digs, and brings the money. But the problem is that the money is ruined because water reached it. Limon feels distressed and decides to find any money for himself so that if he wants to leave Pablo, he can do so. To get money, Limon goes to Maritza, if you remember her, and asks her about the money she took from them. Maritza tells him that the money has been spent, but Limon doesn't believe her and keeps searching for the money until he finds it. Limon becomes angry, and in a moment of rage, he kills Maritza, leaves her body next to her little daughter, and escapes. After that, Limon returns to Pablo and informs him that the money is completely ruined and there wasn't any intact money in the bag, which contained approximately $6,000. Of course, Pablo doesn't believe Limon and thinks he's deceiving him, but he doesn't do anything. Without wasting time, Limon and Pablo leave the farm and go to the city of Medellin, Pablo's birthplace. When Pablo arrives in the city, he is happy to find a signal, so he communicates with Tata and reassures her. Then Pablo goes to an old house of his, isolated from the city, and stays there, constantly communicating with his wife. But we see that there are officers monitoring the communications, among them Officer Hugo Martinez Jr., son of Colonel Martinez. Currently, they intercept the signal of Pablo's communication with his wife and learn that he is in Medellin, and very soon they will be able to reach him. On the other side, Murphy goes with Javier to the airport and bids him farewell because Javier, unfortunately, will return to America, as I mentioned to you. Indeed, Javier bids Murphy goodbye and leaves. Then Murphy meets with Martinez, Officer Jr., and the other officers, and they all learn that Pablo is in the vicinity of Medellin. They decide to increase surveillance more and more to pinpoint his exact location quickly and arrest him. Martinez goes to a meeting with President Cesar Gaviria and other officials and informs them of what happened. Gaviria asks Martinez to kill Pablo and not arrest him at all, but Martinez refuses and tells Gaviria that if Pablo surrenders, he will be arrested only, but if he resists, he will be killed. On the other side, we see that the officer who is securing Tata and Pablo's family informs Tata that protection will soon be lifted from her and the family, and thus they will be alone and anyone could harm them. The officer advises Tata to convince her husband to surrender because if he surrenders, no one will think of harming his family. At this moment, Tata is convinced by all this and continues to communicate with Pablo, asking him to surrender. Pablo tells her that he will think about it and get back to her. When Tata finishes communicating with Pablo, we see that Pablo's mother decides to leave the place and go to her son to be by his side. Indeed, she bids farewell to Tata and the children and leaves. But we see that Martinez was able to intercept the signal of this communication, and immediately informs Martinez and the officers. They now gather and learn the place where Pablo is, according to what Junior determined. They immediately go with a large force to that place, but they don't find Pablo there because Junior unfortunately pinpointed the location incorrectly. Of course, because of that, he feels very frustrated. We return to Pablo again, and we see that he is bored of staying in the house and wants to think by himself. He tells Limon that he will go out for a walk and will return. Although Limon strongly opposes him, Pablo insists on his opinion. Pablo takes his car and keeps driving until he reaches an ice cream shop he used to frequent. The memories pull him, and he gets out to buy ice cream and sits eating it while watching the city where he was raised and lived, as if he is bidding it farewell. Of course, no one recognizes Pablo at all among the people around him because his beard has grown, his appearance has changed a lot, and he has become thinner. While Pablo is sitting, he imagines his cousin Gustavo sitting next to him and keeps telling Gustavo that he misses him greatly in his life and that everything fell apart after his death. This shows, my friend, how much Pablo loved Gustavo, but he lost him. When Pablo finishes his time alone, he returns again to the house and sleeps, so he can think about what he will do and whether he will surrender or not. At that time, Junior is able to intercept that call and determines the place where Pablo is. This time, he gets it right. He goes to the place and finds Pablo in front of him. Of course, he is shocked and immediately contacts Martinez and informs him of Pablo's location. Without delay, Martinez sends a police force led by Murphy, and they go immediately to the house where Pablo is and surround him. At this moment, Pablo turns into a madman, brings out guns, and starts shooting at anyone in front of him. Limon continues to help him, but Limon takes 2 bullets and dies. Yet, Pablo keeps shooting at all the officers in complete madness until a sniper is able to hit him. Pablo falls, bleeding in a shocking scene for everyone. In his last moments, Pablo sees all the officers surrounding him while he lies helpless, realizing at that moment that everything he did in his life was meaningless if this was his end. Now, Officer Trujillo arrives, if you remember him, and shoots Pablo in the head, finishing him off completely. Pablo finally dies after terrorizing the police and the whole world. We see that the officers are unbelievably happy, to the point that they now sit and take pictures with Pablo's corpse after his death. The happiest person with all this is Murphy, who, after years of hard work, was able to reach this moment. As for Cesar Gaviria, as soon as Pablo dies, he announces this news everywhere in the country. Pablo's mother is on a bus heading to him, but she hears the news and believes it. She immediately goes to the place where Pablo died and sees her son's corpse, very saddened. As for Tata, after learning what happened to her husband, she is, of course, very upset, but she decides to act immediately. She takes herself and goes to Gilberto Rodriguez Orihuela and tells him that Pablo has many properties in the city of Medellin. She offers that he can take everything Pablo owns, and in return, he provides her and her children with a life abroad because they won't be able to live in this country after everything that happened. At this moment, Gilberto agrees to her terms, and the agreement is made. Finally, we see that Gilberto meets with his men, Pacho Herrera, Miguel Rodriguez Orihuela, Berna, Fidel Castaño, and Carlos Letter, and informs them that from today, Colombia has become theirs. But don't think that things will go smoothly for Gilberto and that's it. The biggest proof of that is that we now go to Javier in America, and we see that Javier meets with police leaders who inform him that they want him to return to Colombia again and take on the case of Gilberto and his cartel, and they must take them down. Because Gilberto is very dangerous, perhaps more than Pablo himself, and he brings drugs into America more than Pablo did, so he must be stopped. Javier agrees, very happy, because he has long wanted to take down Gilberto and his associates. With this point, this season ends, but the series hasn't ended yet, and we will see in the next season what other things are still hidden. If you want interesting movie recaps, like, share, and subscribe to follow us for more movie recaps.